the few, the mighty, we have all we need to do something, I think. Now, I was asked to talk about inclusive language in the liturgy, and that's what we're going to do, but the poet says, tell the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies. Yeah, Emily Dickinson. So we're going to start a bit obliquely. But don't let me forget to tell you about that when we actually get to another part of it. You may or may not know, it doesn't matter if you don't, that my last name is Garvey, which may seem to have nothing to do with what we're talking about. And we're going to put my first name up there. Okay, that's how I spell it, G-A-R-V-E-Y. It's a given. It was given to me as a child, Garvey. And I hate it when people ask me to spell my name. They almost always go for Garby. And it's one thing when they just think it's Garby. When Steve Garvey was famous in baseball, I thought all my problems are over, and unfortunately it didn't take. But particularly now, if they misspell it and they're trying to send me a receipt by email, say, they're not going to get me if they spell it incorrectly. And it takes a little bit more attention to actually get to my name, or anybody's name, last name. But it has to do in part with respecting me. I mean, that's my name, and that's important. Secondarily, my parents spelled my nickname with an I. And of course, when people write it down, I often get Y's and IEs and E, and on one auspicious occasion, when I was keynoting at a conference, I opened the program to see that I was VYCKE. So apparently they'd made me Scandinavian. Now these may seem to be little things, except it's my name. It's my identity. Our names tell us not only who we are as individuals, but who we are in terms of a tribe. Like, I belong to the tribe of Garvey. Remember when you were little, or, well, I'm assuming that some of you, when you were little, were told by parents, you know, whenever you do things that are naughty, it's my name that gets besmirched. So names are really kind of important. What happens when your name is omitted from a list where it should be? It's as if you were omitted from a list where you should be. Or, you know, you see, this happens, I think, more with men than with women. I'm not sure of that, so you can let me know. But sometimes people, particularly in this country, when your name is, say, Richard, feel free to call you Dick or Dickie. And that may not be who you really are. I mean, you may be a Richard. You may be a Dickie. But people assuming that they can, in fact, name you robs you of something. My brother's name is Russell. When he was little, he was called Russie, but now he wants to be called Russ. He's grown up. So his identity is wrapped up with that name. And when people choose not to use it, it's a kind of a disrespect, particularly if they know that his preference is for one thing or another. For a long time, I still do sometimes, work with children and parents, well-meaning parents, but never having asked me, tell their offspring to call me Miss Vicky. I hate Miss Vicky. My only memory of Miss Vicky is, remember, Tiny Tim's wife. I am not Tiny Tim's wife. I don't want to be Tiny Tim's wife, right? I hate that. So it would be a courtesy to ask me how I wish to be addressed, right? Again, small things, but they go deep because they have to do with our identities, who we are, who we project ourselves to be, and so on. Excuse me. Now, related, and this actually will come into what we do in the prayers of the people. How many of you have ever been in the hospital? Okay.
In the hospital.
Hospital. In the hospital. Yeah, virtually everybody's been in the hospital. I, you may or may not know, was recently in spring in the hospital for 3 weeks. And I confess it's the first time I've been in a hospital since I was 12. And that time it was overnight for tonsils. Now, I have to say that my experience was generally really positive. People were very good to me. I was never referred to as the stroke in 705, at least not within my hearing. So they weren't, in fact, calling me by my disease instead of by my name. I was always addressed either with my first name, I don't know how they spelled it, but, or with a title. However, of all the, I was at the teaching hospital, so, you know, every time they came with rounds, there were 18 people poking me. But of all those people, there were 2 who sort of sucked the energy out of the room. One was a technician who was doing tests on me and never, ever really acknowledged me. It was about my carotid artery. It was all, so I was the carotid artery instead of me. Yes, I suffered a trauma. There's a little hole in my brain, but I'm still myself at the core, and I prefer that people refer to me as who I am. The other instance was somebody, one of my therapists, who was more concerned with what her tests said than with processing, the kind of processing I was doing, so that it was all the book instead of the person who has to do certain things. You see what I'm getting at? It has to do, in the end, it has to do with, for us, with our baptismal vows. Who would have thought that was true? There you go. There you go.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, what you're saying is really interesting, because I was in Paris at a kosher market where a bomb exploded.
Wow.
And as far as they were concerned, I was a Jew just because I was in that kosher market, and that's who I was.
Right. Some of it is assumptions. And people say, well, you know, it's only a name or it's only an assumption, but that stuff matters.
But that's who I was,
Right,
as far
I know,
as they
I
were
know.
concerned.
And people put labels on other people all the time without ever checking with them. And that's a problem. Because it's a problem for people in general, but for we Episcopalians, we have this series of promises that either were made on our behalves, and if these words weren't made on your behalf, if you're older than the 1979 prayer book, these weren't the words. But something very similar was said about you and promised on your behalf. And every time we do a baptism in there, and we're asked to go through the baptismal covenant again to renew our vows, this stuff happens. And we all say, I will, with God's help, and then think nothing of it. But in fact, there is meaning to these words. What does it mean to love other people as we love ourselves? In a certain sense, we can distance those others, but not making assumptions about your identity doesn't pay attention to love. Those people aren't loving you as they love themselves, nor are they paying you dignity and respect. Just the second vow. Yes, it takes a little effort. Of all things, the Christian faith and other faiths take a little effort. It's not a rose garden. And it does, or if it is, it has thorns, right? We're supposed to grow a bit. So for instance, in the liturgy, we often, it's actually in the Book of Common Prayer, whether you use these forms or not, all too often I hear people praying for the sick, the poor, the needy, the prisoners, etc. What we're doing is that classification. We're grouping people as if they're where they are right now is their whole, the whole description of who they are, right? Those of you who've been in the hospital, you were sick. A part of you was damaged in some way. But that doesn't touch you. Why do we do that instead of saying those who are sick? Yeah, that's a passing thing. Those who are needy, those who are in prison, etc. Or why do we, if that weren't important, why is it that sometimes in the prayers of the people, we pray for those who are sick, and then we begin to name them? What we're doing is giving them back their personhood. Or why is it so important on All Souls Day that we simply don't pray for the dead, but we tend to read the names aloud? I don't know whether you do that here. Do you do that here? Do you know you do that here? In lots of churches, right, there are lists. At convention, every year, there's a part of a service that's called the necrology. And we read aloud the names of people that we know who have died, because it brings them, in a sense, it brings them back to life. It says, you're not just the dead, you are a person who has died, yes, but I remember you. I remember you. I'm not omitting you. Or at 9/11 celebrations, always there's the naming of the people who died in the towers and the Pentagon and so on, right? So that is a matter of giving respect to and honoring the dignity of people, each of whom is allied to us for all kinds of reasons, kinship reasons, but on the other hand, who have their individuality as well. And none of that is omitted when we really pay attention, right? Does that make sense? Okay, that's then taking us toward inclusive language in the church. And one of the things I put up here ahead of time was inclusive language is greater than non-sexist language. A lot of people think it means that when we used to say, or in Rite 1 still say, men, that we should say men and women, yeah? That's part of it, because that, in fact, is honoring dignity. Now, I'm not a man. I'm a member of the human race, and I'm a woman. I don't have any problem with men, but don't call me one. When I was in graduate school, and then when I went to Seabury, two different people, one in each place, said to me, and I know that they thought it was a compliment, I like the way you think. You think like a man. Now, I think what they were thinking was, you think linearly. But what they were doing was assuming that all women think with their hearts, and somehow that's less. But I took it not as a compliment, because in fact, I think the way I think. I think the way I've been taught to think. I think in a way probably that's different from everybody else, just as the way you think is different from everybody else, because it's Vicky, it's Vickiness, yeah? It's not, oh, well, you think like a man. No, I don't, thank you very much. I think like me. That's what I think like. So, at any rate, let's do this for a moment. When you think of the word salvation and the Bible, okay, you've got those two things in mind, salvation and the Bible. What do you think is the first salvific act in the Bible? Now, there are no wrong answers, but I'm probably going to disagree with you. The first act of salvation. Oh, come on, you know these things.
Noah?
Noah could, yeah, it's an early one. It's very early. It's only 6 chapters into the Bible. So it certainly could be. God does save Noah and family and certain animals from extinction. That's correct. Anything earlier?
Oh yeah, Adam. Adam laying the son on me.
Adam
As a
and Eve,
sacrifice.
yeah.
No, I don't mean Adam. I mean
Abraham?
Abraham.
Yeah, that's a little later.
Yeah,
That's
but
Genesis
Abraham-
22. That
yeah,
certainly
yes.
was an act of salvation.
Mhm.
Certainly for Isaac.
Certainly.
Right, yeah. And for Abraham, I think, we don't know, one of the things about that story is that we don't know what Abraham is thinking. Lots of times we know what Abraham is thinking. But on this occasion, God says, take your son, your only son, with whom you are one, whom you love, Isaac, and up him on one of the upping places that I'll show you. And it doesn't tell us what Abraham thought. He gets up, the next verse is, so early in the morning he arose and saddled his ass and gathered the wood and got to Lachish, and then his son, and off they went. But we don't know what he's thinking. Yeah, that's an act of salvation. So Noah, and I, because you said Adam, I was thinking of Adam, and Adam and Eve, in a certain sense, are an act of salvation.
Creation.
Yes! That's what I would say, and I'm not alone in this. And part of that has to do with the fact that the root of the word, the Hebrew word that means salvation, at its really primitive, dig down, it means to make room for. The rabbis, at one point, they're great at asking questions, and they asked the question, if God in the beginning was all in all, if there was nothing but God in the beginning, then how did creation take place? And they rattled that on for centuries and then came up with one explanation. They had several, but the one that I think is germane to us is God cared enough about creation that God inhaled a little, suicide a little, to make room. It's absolute hospitality and salvation, to make room for another person. And when you think about hospitality, then you think that particularly when we're having somebody over to dinner, if it's just, people we've been friends, next door neighbors, we love the next door neighbors, we've lived together for 30 years, but they know us, they're like old bedroom slippers. They're that comfortable, right? So we don't put on anything fancy for people that we know really well. But if we had invited someone who is in some way exalted, if the bishop were coming to dinner, he wouldn't think of himself that way, but if he were coming, what would we do in preparation?
Clean the house.
God knows I'd clean the house. Yeah, right. What else would we do?
Set a beautiful table.
Right? And make what kind of food? Yeah, the very best. We would not think of this particularly as extra effort, because what we think is, no, we're just making ready for someone whom we respect and who has dignity. So we pull out all the stops. And yet often in churches I hear, well, we talk about our hospitality and that red, white, and light blue sign that says the Episcopal Church welcomes you, right? All of us have them. And I wonder sometimes, because all too often I hear people in the pews say things, including clergy who aren't in the pews, say things like, well, they have to learn the prayer book. So we shouldn't help people who are newcomers with the service. They just need to learn the prayer book, right? We put the onus back on them instead of us as the welcoming community. Or we say, they don't know where the bathroom, we don't have good signage. If somebody needs to go to the bathroom, they ask. Well, some people are a little hesitant to ask that question. It's on us. We're the welcomers. We should never ask the question, or we never make the statement, it's too much. If we are about the business of hospitality and inclusion, which is what hospitality really means, then in fact, we're always pulling out all the stops as if Jeff Lee's coming to dinner. Yeah. Or the King of England, or somebody. That's what these baptismal vows are in fact saying to us. And all too often, I think we don't think about that. And inclusive language is just the tip of the iceberg. Because one of the things is it's a slippery slope. You begin categorizing people as you were categorized in that kosher market. And then it doesn't take, it's not many steps to then calling people by names, right? Does this make sense? And then calling them really nasty names. One of the brilliant things the Nazis did in Germany was they started with language. You call people vermin, and you do it enough. And what do we do with vermin? We exterminate them. It becomes easier. The more we withdraw from a person, the easier it is to categorize people. So, for instance, one of the things on the last page here is this little visual, which says, those illegal aliens, and next to it, it says, would you have said that had you known that I was not a citizen? That is, we sometimes say things about other people when we know they're not there, right? There's a, I think, oh yeah, it is. It's the quotation beside that, who, it's written by a bishop, who's a bishop of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and he talks about overhearing conversations. And the fact is, we're free to categorize or name other people when we think they're not there. And we say terrible things about them. When we say those kinds of things in front of our children, we're forming them in very dangerous ways. And to speak when we think we're alone, you do it enough, and then it begins to happen in other places, right? Okay, let's take a, oh, this is just a little footnote, but I want to tell you about this. You know what that is? What picture that is? Or what it pictures better spoken? Have any of you ever been to Milan, Italy? Some of you have. The Duomo, which is the second largest cathedral in the world. It is medieval. But underneath it, they found ruins. And that is the Cathedral of St. Thecla, built in the early 4th century. And it's believed to be, that particular space is believed to be the baptismal font where Anselm baptized Augustine. It's kind of cool. When I was there, it sent chills down me. Whoa! Which is why I put it there because of the baptismal vows. But if we look inside a little bit, I know I don't usually do this with you, but one of the things that you'll notice in all the scriptural comments I have here is Jesus' insistence, in fact, God's insistence on being holistic. When I am lifted up, I will cause all, not just adult males who own property and who are white, but all people to myself. I will gather all to myself. There's an enormous amount of inclusivity right there in the text. The second quotation is about God not being a patriarch. Now, when we say God isn't a patriarch, do you know what I'm talking about? It's not simply male parent. Patriarchs in the ancient world had the power of judgment. They tended to be distant and ruling. The God of the Hebrew Bible and the God of Jesus, for the most part, don't act like that. You know, when Jesus tells the parable of the so-called prodigal son, we all know that. When I use that language, we all know where I'm going, right? Prodigal son. It's not the son who's really prodigal, it's the father who's prodigal. But the father, because wasteful of love is what he's wasteful of. In that story, he doesn't act like a normal patriarch. That is not the way the father in ancient Roman society would have acted. When you think about how he acts, you remember the story, right? Mm-hmm. One of the funny things that I think of every so often is it must have taken some time for the younger son to grab his belongings, go, and then blow the whole inheritance. That takes a little while, right? But when he makes the decision to go back home, his father is waiting. It's as if he's been at the living room window the whole time, looking out. And then, instead of waiting for the son to come to him, which would have been the correct thing to do in a patriarchy, he runs out the door and embraces his son before he can make a confession. The other thing is you have to think about what they wore. Men didn't wear trousers in the first century, right? So they have this kind of toga or robe thing. And when you run, what happens to that toga thing?
Flaps open.
Pardon me?
Doesn't it flap open?
It flaps open, exposing parts of yourself that you don't necessarily want to have exposed. Anyway, it's inelegant. A patriarch would never do that. So this is whenever Jesus talks about God, he's talking about a very countercultural authority figure. And particularly, this is not a patriarch. So anyway, the beginning of this thing says, God isn't a patriarch, and then it quotes Paul in Galatians, and that's actually a baptismal formula, that we're no longer this thing. We're no longer categorized by race or class or gender, but everybody is supposed to be all one in Christ. So in the era in which Paul was speaking, and given that he was speaking to his own people, his own tribe, his Pauline tribe, in fact there were differences, really grave differences, between Jews and Greeks, between slave and free, and certainly between men and women. He's making a really, really outstanding and strange comment there. Let me see what else I want to point to. That's a particular. Oh, when I started looking, I've done stuff with inclusive language for years. When I went to graduate school for my doctorate, I went in 1978. And one of the first things that they told us in our introduction to being graduate students there was that inclusive language, that at that point it only meant gender. It only meant male, female. Inclusive language was expected in all oral and written work. All right, then I get to Seabury and found it interesting that I had to sort of fight the battle again. It's an expectation, and then it's not an expectation. And people saying to me things like, it's only words. Words are amazing. They create whole words, like whole worlds, yeah. I know who I am, partially because of my name, but also because of what other people tell me about who I am. This is really true of children, but it's also true of adults. Years ago, I was teaching in a high school. It was a high school for girls, and we had one group of sophomores that everybody called the baddies. Now, okay, there we do the assumption again. They were from rough neighborhoods. Many of them were members of gangs. Interestingly enough, they were all white. But at any rate, one kid, for instance, she's the third child in 5, and her father was in prison for grand larceny and attempted murder. Her mother was at home with the kids, but when she would take them shopping from the time they could walk, and she would always instruct them that they were supposed to steal one thing. And they were punished if, when they got home, they didn't have something that they had stolen. This is the household in which this kid grew up. She's 14 years old and already aimed in one direction. She was in that class. There was another kid who at 15, they're 15 years old, he had already had 2 abortions. She's 15 years old and she's had 2 abortions. It's like that crowd. Anyway, to cut to the chase, everybody called them the baddies. And I happened to be what they used to call a supervising teacher. So I would teach new teachers how to teach, which meant that I got my pick of the classes, and I chose the baddies, because I knew I didn't want to put new people with them, and I didn't want non-understanding people. So anyway, one day, it was a religion class, and I said, I want you to read Genesis 1, just Genesis 1. There are only 31 verses. Just read that, and let's see what you come up with. So the next morning, I asked them, did they read it? Well, of course, they're going to tell me yes. And I said, what did you think? And they didn't say anything, because they're 15, right? 15-year-olds don't talk. And then I said, well, all right, what did you think when it said God saw everything that was good and thought it was really very good? Nothing, except rolling of the eyes. So then I said, it means that you're good, and you're good, and you're good, and you're good, and I pointed my finger at as many kids there were. And what happened amazed me. One of these really tough kids started crying. And the rest of them immediately went to comfort her. And I have no idea what has just happened. So I asked them, what is this about? And one of them said, did you mean what you said? And I said, what? And they said, you called us good. And I said, yeah, that's the day of your creation. God, as a matter of fact, sort of, metaphorically, sat up and clapped and said, hooray! Yeah. And they said, nobody's ever said that about us before. Everybody's always categorized us as bad. And I think I might have said to you at one occasion or another that one of the besetting sins of teachers, and I was a teacher, am a teacher, is to assume behavior. You know, this little pocket over here, they're always obstreperous. So if I hear some noises and something going on in the room, even if my ears are telling me it's over here, what I do is look there. Because I'm assuming that those kids are going to misbehave, which is inviting them to misbehave. Jesus says, whose sins you bind, they will be bound, and whose sins you release will be released. I was binding certain kids in that behavior. It doesn't make them do it, but what it says is, I must be bad, so therefore I act bad. So I'm reinforcing that stereotype all over again. So we think of words, they're only words. No, they're very, very, very powerful words. And what I started to say was, when I started to put this thing together, I remembered that in 1978, it was an expectation at higher learning, not so back in the seminary, but I was looking at published works on inclusive language. The first inclusive language lectionary, which we use, or can use, far too seldom do we use, was published in 1985. It's 30 years old, and we're still talking about this. Yeah? EOW, Enriching Our Worship, do you know about that? Okay, we've got the prayer book. And because of what the paragraph says, where is the paragraph that says it? A concern, it's on page 3, it's not page 3, a concern for inclusive language and having to do with diversity. This church began to take notice of the fact that we were leaving people out, that we were making assumptions, and that we were making some people have to do mental tricks to understand that they were part of the group. When we say, for us and for all men, I have to think, wait, that particular men is supposed to include me, not all men. Every time I see the word men, it doesn't include me. If I go to the men's room, somebody's going to raise holy hell, right? That's a little caricature. But at any rate, Enriching Our Worship was first published in 1997. It is, goes along with the prayer book. It's approved for use in churches. And all it does is pays attention to, the first edition was only about gender, but subsequent editions have paid attention to the whole world of inclusivity, so that all language we pay attention to. Do we call, for instance, nowadays we tend to call people who have some difficulty walking, talking, seeing, hearing, as being differently abled, because we've begun to understand, yeah, we know that they are differently abled, but we know that when one sense shuts down, other senses rush in to help. So in fact, people who can't hear physically have different and probably accentuated possibilities in the other four senses. Yeah, so that's differently able. Like I'm short. I'm differently able than taller people, right? There are certain things I can't do, there are certain things I can do. So it's simply taking account of the reality of the situation and not automatically consigning people to their weakness, like, you know, the crip, right? Or other.
We think it's broken. Yeah.
We think it's broken?
Yeah.
Okay, then I'll just shout from here. All right. Obviously, what I'm beating the dead horse here about is the fact that language counts. It really counts, and it can wound us. When we learned as kids, sticks and stones don't break our bones, they do. Language can kill as much, in a different way than a gun can or a knife can. Language is powerful, powerful stuff. And if we want to be clear in our language, then we're clear in our language. If we mean all people, then we use the expression all people. Children are, among other things, little literalists. So if we use language that excludes a part of the population, they think it's excluding part of the population, when in fact the speaker may think he or she is including everybody. Sometimes you have to then fill in the gaps by, this is actually a biblical thing. In highly inflected languages like Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic, the biblical languages, and modern languages such as, the Romance languages such as Italian, French, German, almost everything is inflected. So verbs tell you not only what tense and voice and mood, but also the gender of the person. Yeah? That doesn't happen in English, except for he, she, and it. Except for the third person singular. Everything else, if a bunch of people are going to the movies and they're mixed, so they're male and female couples. So Bill and Judy and Tom and Henrietta, et cetera, they go. If I refer to them by a pronoun, I will say they or them. And you won't know, unless I've already told you their names, that that group consists of males and females. But in Greek and Hebrew and all those other languages, you would know, sort of. You would know that it's all males because the pronoun would be males and the end of the verb would be masculine. But if, in these foreign languages, if we have 15 men and 15 women all going together and we threw it into the pronoun would be marked in the masculine, even though it's a mixed group. If there are 29 women and 1 man, it goes into the masculine. English is actually much more inclusive, because when we say they, it can be men and women, it can be only men, it can be children, it can be anybody, right? Sometimes in the Bible, we are persuaded, because of the male-oriented language that has been handed down to us, we are persuaded when we see the they or the them or others to think it must be all men. Sometimes, though, in the old translation in the Hebrew Bible of Israel as a group, they were called sons of Israel, but in fact sons meant sons and daughters. So lots of times it's a mixed group. Sometimes when you're talking about circumcision, for Israel, it only meant men. In Egypt, it meant men and women. There is a little passage that nobody ever reads. It's in the Gospel of Luke, and Luke is this year, so listen for this when it comes up in the lectionary. In chapter 8, the most famous thing about chapter 8, I have to keep looking at what time it is. Okay, we're good. In chapter 8, the most famous thing about it is the parable of what we call the parable of the sower, which is already misleading because the parable is not about the sower at all. The sower is incidental. It's the seed that's important and the earth that receives the seed, right? But right before Jesus tells that parable, there's 3 verses that introduce the chapter, and for some seem to be a buffer between chapter 7 and chapter 8. It's about Jesus is traveling around doing what he does. He's preaching and teaching and healing people and doing all kinds of good stuff. And with him are the 12. And then it says, and also with him were, and it names 3 women. Mary of Magdala, whom we know. Joanna, whom we don't know. We don't have a clue who she is. And Susanna, who's the wife of a guy named Chuza, who we've never heard of. And then it says, and others. Now, that others is feminine plural, which means that all the others are women. And what do they do? Do you have any idea what they do? They pay for Jesus' ministry. These are the ones who are footing the bills. These are the ones who are paying for the food, the lodging, and all the rest of it. It's all women who do it. And then Jesus tells the parable of the sower. And what he's talking about is good people who use their wherewithal to be able to produce for others. And what's been introduced is this strange little 3-verse thing about women who spend their wherewithal for the sake of others. But again, if you just read the others, I think most people would think, well, it's either mixed or it's all male. And it's not. It's all female. Weird. Just kind of weird. A couple more things to notice. One of them is when you go right in the middle of the text, right in the middle of the handout, second paragraph from the bottom, because this for us is about change, and change is always frightening to people. And I think Eric Law, who's an Episcopal priest in the Diocese of Los Angeles, gets the point here. It's because change may appear to be out there somewhere, but if it's real change that involves us really at a deep level, and language is always at a deep level, it's messing with ancient stuff in us, and that's hard. But on the top of the inside back cover, it says, the inclusiveness of the church is precisely what makes it demanding. It is. This is not easy stuff. It's easier to say, because we've been used to saying, for instance, all men, or pray for the sick. It takes a little extra thought to, in fact, include more people, and include them blatantly. Not say, well, as too many people have said, well, you know, it includes whoever you want. Yeah, that's demeaning me. That's a double demeaning. Already you're expecting to use this language, and then you're saying it's my fault that we're moving in this direction. That's a double insult. Okay, so I think in the end, it takes effort, but it also is the clearest way of expressing oneself. To say something, when I mean to delineate people, I will delineate people. I'm trying to think of the easiest way to say this. I used to teach languages, and when teaching people how to speak another language or translate another language, the thing that you want to do is communicate to another person in a way that the other person actually understands from where they live. Let me give you an example. They were translating the Bible for a group of people who live on the equator. And they came to Isaiah when he says at one point, though your sins be scarlet, I will make them white as snow. Well, scarlet meant, colors have meanings. So scarlet had a different meaning there. And you're on the equator, so snow, they know nothing about snow. And if you try and do something like say, well, describe it, it's water, but it's hard water, which is also soft, it makes no sense. So what they did was learned the culture of these people and learned what they valued. White as snow, to us who know about snow, new fallen snow and that kind of whiteness looks like purity to us. Yeah, that's what Isaiah was trying to say. So what in their culture would fit that, and what they came up with, though your sins be deadly, I think they didn't use the word scarlet because it had a different meaning to that. I will make them soft as egret feathers. Because the egret had symbolism which had to do with purity in that culture. So, is that what it says in Hebrew? Absolutely not. But is that what Isaiah meant? Absolutely yes. Yeah? So, it has to do with clarity. Not just my clarity, but your clarity. So that when I put something out in the air, I expect you to be able to catch it and retain it, retain my thought. And the only way I can do that is to be as clear as possible as I can with my language. And that's what we're asking for with inclusive language in the church. That we when we say the Episcopal Church welcomes you, it means all of you. All y'all, as they say in the South, right? All y'all. Whether you're that big or that big. Whether you're 25, this is another thing that's making the rounds. Because the church talks a lot about youth, as if people with my hair color need not apply. That's exclusive. It has to do with all of us. And paying attention to all of us. And not just glomming us all into the poor. Or the Episcopalians. I put the joke about Episcopalians in there because we sometimes suffer. Because we've got this reputation for being very snooty, very wealthy, and drunk. Yeah? And that hurts. Because we're not all that. There are people who have difficulties with alcohol. There are snooty people among us. There are very rich people. But that's not all of us, right? I resent that. That when people say Episcopalian, that's what they think. So I need to be clearer about my language and the way I obviously comport myself in order to get rid of jokes like that. Does this all make sense? Okay, good. I think you're about to go to church.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Now I go at least back out into the winter.
Yes. It looks like the stuff has been removed that you used for.
Yeah, and it may be cool.
Sometimes I think, I agree with all this. I mean, I would say the message of this was that salvation comes with inclusion. But one time I was
What's wrong with this door?
and I had this.
Well, the other side of it,
Doesn't want to come out?
fixture's out.
This is the way I remember
See
it.
down below?
Good to see you.
And so I looked at
It's
it,
out.
the King James Version,
It must,
and of course,
must be
what they had done,
under repair.
what they had done, whether it was anything, so it was not, so that it was not gender specific, which was well intentioned. But the passage lost its beauty because it had made everything that was plants and growing feminine, and it made everything else
Well,
masculine.
yeah.
Well,
As soon as we can.
I don't see anything wrong with that.
We have a little.
It's a wonderful passage, but it lost envelope
We'll get there again.
by taking all that out. And I don't call that really inclusion. I call that somehow not seeing what was there.
Sometimes inclusive
I
language.
call that, I wouldn't even call that inclusion. And they might have said, well, we've rewritten this so it's inclusive. I thought, I don't think that really is inclusive. I think you had an agenda there and you kind of missed.
Sometimes that's right. Sometimes,
And it's not,
you know, we just use God, and he instead of he. I think we're losing something.
He's not in.
and there were some other things wrong with the passage. It was a terrible thing. I think the last line was this wonderful line. It was, in the King James, it's, he who holds the reins takes it to the one who is in charge.
So anyway,
You know, they got rid of the he,
Yeah.
but they also knocked out the metaphor. And so,
Well,
you know, the passage lost all of it.
Right. What I
And
have
I just apologize. I said, I've got to read this in the King James.
and sometimes the King James is wrong.
Well, it's just absolutely wrong. Wrong in the sense that it's mistranslated.
Yeah. But I know what you mean. I know what you mean. Sometimes we lose the
You know, I
metaphor.
have no idea whether the Hebrew being part of this stuff at the time, but that's, who knows?
I'm
I mean,
always
there's
happy when he
something
goes to
creative.
sleep.
Part of a guy who,
after,
you know, whoever was doing that, King James thing at that point. You know, maybe he just thought, wow, I'll make this part master.
But anyway, we will be going.
What the original was. So as a translation, who knows? But it was clear their agenda was we're going to make this what they thought was inclusive. But I thought, no, this is they've set up a parade between
Sometimes
masculine
that
and feminine images,
Sometimes
and you've lost that.
Yeah,
You've lost
and
that.
that's why we have to have these kinds of conversations, because it can't go all the other way.
Yeah.
And we can't
Well,
lose.
or if it goes all the other way,
Because they're busy. I mean,
when I think I'm being inclusive and I'm not being inclusive, you can go. It's not even going all the other way. It's misunderstanding what you're doing.
Right.
oh,
That does happen, but that's why we have these conversations.
Exactly.
Right. Yes, right.
Yes.
Yeah. I agree with you.
well, especially
I
if
thought you would.
you want to go to bed at 3 a.m. and get up at like,
Well,
some
we
point
had,
in your life,
we had a
say, that isn't
horrible.
gonna work.
You better get that now.
Right, right,
And I don't
used
know
to that.
what,
right.
was set up wrong.
And, you know,
But,
we assume that he.
we invited a Muslim to come and talk.
Yeah.
I don't see that though, so, who knows?
And he was a converted Muslim. He'd been in
No, the first
store.
time, Michael was the first to go up.
And somehow it turned into
He
this
came home and
just general attack on everything
finally
really
Rick
bad
said,
session. I was so embarrassed.
your mother
Uh,
does not
Yeah, well,
go
that-
yeah,
until you're in the house.
somehow we should have heard this
You may
talk
not know,
confusion
she
beforehand.
may be in
Uh,
bed, but
But
she is.
the whole thing was done wrong, and we didn't have a moderator who
You
was
can't do this stuff.
up to it. Didn't know what to
Maybe
do.
work a little bit.
Yeah, help for a day.
Yeah. But it turned out to be
They don't
just
even
throwing
think
stones
about
at
it.
this guy from all,
I didn't understand.
it was really
I
bad
didn't
session.
get it.
Well,
Really,
it's-
really
I
bad.
look at the politics right now and
Yeah, well,
immigration
it was the
and all that.
politics right now that obviously
We had
brought it on.
ours. We had to be in.
Well, we're living in.
Yes.
You
we're
signed
living at a
in
time
and you
where
were.
this is all the more important.
Absolutely, yeah, I didn't even,
Now there's freedom to learn, to grow
In
up.
fact, I thought maybe you would be asked to come because we had that. This happened
no,
back
they asked
to
me,
maybe 4
I was
months
asked
ago.
last spring.
Okay,
to come.
I thought, well, maybe they asked you just because we, it was, what was it, Switzer said you looked at God in the face of a stranger?
Yeah.
Well, we were not doing it that
Oh,
day.
my goodness.
yeah.
Well,
Well, good luck
We were
with
not
your,
very good.
Yeah, fear does
Operation
strange
schedule.
things.
Well, thanks a lot for
Oh,
coming.
you're welcome.
That's one of the issues,
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
last week, that,